Good evening and welcome to the Veterans for Peace Annual Convention. It is a pleasure for me to introduce Oren Lyons, who will give us greetings for this evening. Oren is Faithkeeper of the Turtle Clan of the Onondaga Nation, one of the 6 nations of the people of the Longhouse, whose territory once encompassed most of New York, Pennsylvania, part of Ohio and in the United States, and Ontario and Quebec in Canada. As Faithkeeper, he is entrusted to maintain the customs, traditions, values, and history of the Turtle Clan. He has dedicated himself to promoting Native American rights and protecting the earth. Thank you, Oren Lyons, for joining us this evening.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. Greetings to one and all, and I appreciate the fact that you're gathering for the principle of peace. Many, many hundreds of years ago, our confederation called Haudenosaunee, which means the people of the Longhouse, were gathered together by a spiritual being. There's no other way to describe the leadership of this person. Came amongst our people maybe 1600 years ago. And at that time, our people had fallen into very much like what the world is today, on a smaller scale, of course. But there was a great deal of strife, of warfare, and a spiritual leader in the story of where he comes from and how he got here is too long to get into it, but suffice to say that he did arrive on a canoe, on a stone white canoe coming from the northeast corner of what we call Lake Ontario now, and arrived at the Mohawk territory. And when he arrived at the Mohawk territory, there were 2 men who were watching this arrival at very early morning. And they were men without title, as we say. But they were also part of the backbone of the nation. And as they saw this white canoe coming, they took their arrows out and they knocked it into their bow, and they watched him come into the land. It was a white canoe made of stone, floating. And when he landed, he was a very imposing figure, and they asked him in the Mohawk language, "What is your purpose for being here? Who are you?" And he answered, "Peace." And they were deliberating at that moment whether to just dispatch him right there. And they asked him to repeat what he said, and he said, "Peace." They looked at each other and they said to him in their language, "Well, there's not much of that around here." And they really began to recognize this as an imposing figure, and perhaps they should take him to their leaders, which is, and in the meantime, he stood there and they asked him to take that hogan that was sitting over to the side there. They said, there's a hogan over there. Would you go over there? And there's a woman in there by the name of Ganyonsasa, and remain there while we will carry your message. So one went and one stood there, and he went into the hogan, and there was a woman inside. And it was a long journey for this man running to his nation. And so he had the evening to spend. And during that time, he talked to Ganyonsasa, and he asked, and he explained his mission of peace. And she said, well, my hogan here is open to one and all. As they come back and forth, she says, I'm tired of this fighting that's going on all the time. But these men can come into my hogan for food and rest, but they must leave their weapons outside, and they must not speak about the wars or what they're doing. She said, I just give them something to eat and let them rest. I'm tired of this. And so that was the beginning of our confederation, because he went to the Mohawks. And that was a long story. And finally, he had to convince almost all of the 5 original nations, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, the Senecas, and he did. But what I'm saying is that his mission was peace. And the long story, at the end of this particular story, it was agreed by these 5 warring nations that they would establish this confederation, and it would be based on peace. And for the symbol of this confederation, the peacemaker planted a great white pine. It had 4 white roots in the 4 cardinal directions of the earth. And as they said, it reached high to the sky. And he said, this is your home. This is the base of your home. It's based on peace. This is the great tree of peace. And those 4 directions, 4 cardinal directions, peoples and nations can follow those roots back here and come under the protection. And so many hundreds of years ago, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, before the white man came here to our lands, there was established this great confederation based upon peace. And as you know, today, this is the discussion of why you have gathered yourselves for these in preparation to speak about peace. And I will say that tomorrow, our confederation still stands, and the 6 nations now will come. In the course of history, not very long ago, 1712 by your calendar, the Tuscarora Nation joined our confederation and came under the great law of peace. And so tomorrow, our confederation will meet. And this is precisely this is what we're going to be talking about. Exactly. Part of our discussion tomorrow will still be about peace. And so I'm very grateful that you have gathered yourself under that principle because, as you well know, this whole population of humanity around the earth has been, I would say, stumbling on these issues of war. Facing us collectively as the human species today is a change. We have affected the whole system that supports life here on Earth. And we have been told before that this would be coming at some time. And I've heard that ever since I was a small boy. I heard that prediction, and I used to think this is going to be very terrible for some people way, way, way in the future. They talk about 7 generations, our leaders said. Our mission is for those generations coming. And what is the mission? The mission is peace. And so, as we gather ourselves today and we make an assessment as to what you have gathered yourselves for today, we make an assessment of our situation as a human species here on this earth. And the assessment, from my perspective, is not very good. And it's been deteriorating over my lifetime. And what I used to think that this problems that would face our humanity, or our prophecies have told us that this time was coming. And I used to worry about those generations coming, that they would have to face a collapse of everything that we know. And as I grew older, and I should let you know that I'm now 93 years old, and I have seen changes that most people have not, because I grew up during the horse and buggy era as far as our nation was concerned. We had only one car at Onondaga that I saw. It was all horses and wagons and buggies. And now today, or I just returned really from Santa Fe, New Mexico, in a plane. And from those horse and buggy days, I flew a jet yesterday, day before yesterday, I flew a jet back here. So I've experienced the whole spectrum of change. And the experience has been, of course, enlightening to me. I've learned over a period of time a lot of things. I've experienced a lot of things, and I had accepted the responsibility of Faithkeeper to sit on the Council of Chiefs, the Onondaga Council of Chiefs, in 1965. So I've been sitting in this position of responsibility for 55, 56 years now. And I've seen great changes during that time. And so as you gather yourselves here now on this issue of peace, just as our people gathered 1,600 years ago on the same issue, what has changed has been the volume of people. In 1950, as you remember, a war broke out in Korea. And I was 20 years old then, and I went into the service like all the men were. I was drafted into the service. And in 1950, and I wound up in the 82nd Airborne Division. The first large airplane I ever saw in my life, I jumped out of. That was quite an experience. But anyway, where we are today in these past years is very much in need of your mission, peace. That is the only pathway to the salvation of what we have on earth today. In 1950, there were some 2.5 billion people in the world. And now, 70 years later, there's over 8 billion people. Triple the population in one lifetime. The carrying capacity of the earth could sustain that if everything was equitable and equal, but it is not. We face a variety of problems, practical problems of, say, water. Water is life, as you well know. And here in the northern part of the United States, we have the Great Lakes, which is a quarter of the water of the whole world. That's potable, drinkable. And even with that precious commodity, we continue to violate that water, contaminate that water. In places like the Mideast, there's no water. They're running out of water. What are they going to do? Where is the equity for things of that nature? And so now, today, we have destabilized our very existence here by mining, by extracting, by taking things without concern for the future. And the consequence of that, of course, is we've jeopardized ourselves, our children, our grandchildren. And as our council sits and will meet tomorrow on issues like this, we look at a very disturbing future that is looking 7 generations. And I'm talking about a full generation of a person 7 times. It's very murky out there. The future is very, very murky. And a lot of that problems have come from this constant warfare that's been going on around the world, and the inequity that prevails everywhere. Just the other day, just reading some of the information that comes out now, and they said that the over 700 billionaires that here in the United States, it's quite a number, 700 billionaires in the United States, have almost 70% of the wealth. And they are less than 1% of the population of the world here. 7 or 70% of the wealth. That's a huge inequity. So you're gathering a price, you know, and what your discussion on where is this wealth coming from? Much of it is coming from extraction, mining. Not only the earth, but the oceans as well. These corporations are responsible for the degradation of all life here. So your meeting is much needed, and your discussion, although very late in the day, is extremely necessary. And I appreciate your courage, and I appreciate your foresight, because you, as veterans, have experienced the worst of what human beings can do to one another. You've survived that, and you've gathered yourself on the issue of peace. And I commend you for that. And join with us, who this issue of peace has been with us for some 1,600 years at least. Much needed today, as you see. And to remind you, you know, of the odds that have prevailed from that time that I was a 20-year-old person going into the United States Army, into the 82nd Airborne. The numbers of people on Earth. At that time, some 2.5 billion. Now, at the age of 93, I see over 8 billion here. That's your battle, that's your odds. How do we sustain equity? And what is facing us at the moment is basically how we have affected the earth, and those who are most responsible for that are corporate mining. There's no doubt about that. And the inequity of wealth. So in your discussions, as you work towards affecting a change towards peace, you will know that we tomorrow will be meeting almost on the same subject as well. Over these many, many years, in my 93 years, which is pretty long when you talk about humanity's life, but very, very short when you talk about humanity or a human's life compared to the life of a mountain or the life of a lake or a tree or nature. And so we're here actually for a very short time, and it's incumbent upon us to do our duty, which is to take care of life itself, to support life, equity. And when I say, well, I'm not just talking about human beings, I'm talking about trees, I'm talking about all the animals, all the fish of the sea, I'm talking about everything that grows, the plants. That's all our responsibility. We have the advantage and also responsibility from that advantage of the foreknowledge of death. Many animals know when it's imminent and they prepare for it, but they don't know in the beginning, like we do, that will happen. And with that foreknowledge of death, we have to work within that time frame ourselves personally to see what we can do for the welfare of future generations. And like I said, not only people, but the trees, the animals, fish of the sea, everything that walks, crawls, flies, swims, all life. I urge you to work hard on this. You have gathered yourself on this mission of peace, and I appreciate that very, very much, because that's been our mission for a long time. And I appreciate the alliance for the common cause of welfare of life. With that, I wish you well. I wish you good luck in your challenges. And I thank you for your work. Donate.
Thank you so much, Oren Lyons, for joining us this evening and for your words of wisdom. We will continue to work hard and strive to work together and work for peace on the earth, for humans, and for all living things. You are an inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to move the program around a little bit. I know we were going to go to Marjorie Cohn next, but bear with us. We have a very special guest joining us this evening from Ukraine. Yurii Sheliazhenko, thank you so much for coming to the Veterans for Peace Convention. It is an honor for us to have you here as our guest. I would just like to remind people that you are Executive Secretary of the Ukrainian Pacifist Movement, a board member of the European Bureau for Conscientious Objection, member of the Board of Directors of World Beyond War, member of the Council International Peace Bureau, and member of the Council of War Resisters. I would just like to begin quoting words of yours that I think are so important for us all to hear about your ongoing struggle for peace in the world. I will not run from my home and my country. If I am sent to prison for pacifism, I will find a way to be useful for peace-loving Ukraine, even in prison. I will think, write, and seek ways to contribute to a permanent worldwide dialogue on peace. Thank you so much, Yurii, for joining us this evening. We are deeply grateful to have you with us.
Thank you for invitation, and it is honor to me to be with you here, because your organization is very important participant of worldwide peace dialogue, and I hope big changes. Dear friends, greetings from Kiev, capital of Ukraine. There were 6 air raid alerts here today, and so I spent my evening in the shelter. Sirens howl anytime when a Russian jet MiG-31K is in the air and could launch a Kinzhal hypersonic missile, one of those used to destroy Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Kiev today has good air defense in case of rocket attacks and raids of killer drones. And still there is a level of danger for civilian lives. In other cities, it is much higher danger. Ukrainian cities are ruined, environment polluted. Many people are killed, wounded, forced to leave their homes, and total death toll after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine exceeded 500,000, among them 300,000 Russian troops, near 200,000 Ukrainian troops, and tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilians. It is quite obvious the war should be ended, at least for humanitarian reasons. We need to stop the war and to start reconciliation from simple steps like ceasefire and peace talks. But obstacles to this is determination in Kiev and in Moscow to fight for victory. I have no interest in discussion how the offensives and counteroffensives are successful or not. Let's merely point out that as long as the mass killing continues and diplomacy fails, we lose lives. Of course, merchants of death and their stockholders gain their bloody money, and Lockheed Martin will make fortune on his F-16 bonanza with taste of nuclear brinksmanship. But when they profit, we the people lose lives, and President Zelensky is not going to stop it. He has so-called Ukrainian formula of peace, which is essentially a pretext to wage defensive war forever. Key part of this so-called formula of peace is the Kiev Security Compact, which envisages decades of Western's weapons supply to Ukraine and turning all population into soldiers. Obviously, Ukrainian pacifist movement had another ideas about peace, and we were punished for that. I was searched, my computer and smartphone were seized, I was placed under the night home arrest for alleged crime of justification of Russian aggression. And absurd pretext for it was a statement peace agenda for Ukraine and the world, which condemns Russian aggression, calls to peace by peaceful means, diplomacy, nonviolent resistance, unarmed civilian protection. It upholds right to refuse to kill. I sent this statement to Zelensky, and the only response was these political repressions of his security service. Of course, it was not the only reason. I learned that I am under surveillance at least during a year, and the spies were especially interested in my human rights defending activities. I helped with legal aid to prisoner of conscience Vitaly Alexeyenko, jailed for his refusal to serve in army. Supreme Court of Ukraine decided to release him and ordered retrial. 3 days ago, Vitaly submitted constitutional complaint to Constitutional Court of Ukraine, which I wrote for him. Also, I helped our member, a Christian pacifist Andriy Vishnevetsky, taken to frontline military unit against his faith, to submit a lawsuit asking Supreme Court to order President Zelensky to establish procedure of discharge from army on the grounds of conscience. You have such procedure in Army of United States, and in Europe, part of which Ukraine wants to be, it is one of human rights standards recognized by Cabinet of Ministers of Council of Europe. But Ukrainian army refuses to recognize human right to conscientious objection to military service. Zelensky says it is a fight for democracy against autocracy. Where he learned it. Anyway, Where is democracy if advocacy of peace and nonviolence is censored and repressed? Conscientious objectors to military service jailed. Borders are closed to prevent people from fleeing and turn youth into cannon fodder. People abducted at streets against their will to send them to frontline. War and hatred infects our souls. It is sick. People see enemies around and even teach children to continue this dumb war of our generation. And when children play in camouflage uniform, once they were confused with a detachment of Russian saboteurs and shooted to death. It is a real recent story. Ukrainian military proudly exhibit killer drones in theater in the center of city of Chernihiv, and Russian army bombs the city, killing civilians and children. War is madness. It is nature of war. This truth must be told. We need truth-telling about inevitable violations of human rights and international humanitarian law by Russian army waging war of aggression and unfortunately Ukrainian army waging war of defense and all other army in the world. We need to talk about criminal character of any law to counteract propaganda of war and militarism, to resist militarism and the war. Peace education is needed. Human rights defense is needed. And peace activists and human rights defenders need protection, support, funding, and so on. Putin and Zelensky has unrealistic maximalist goals regarding victory in war and territorial control. Difference is, of course, that Putin's maximalism violates international law. Still, both maximalisms are sympathetic to populations in their countries. It is tempting. Even beyond that, everybody knows deeply in our hearts that we can't return to the past status quo. World is changing. People must be told that we equally can't destroy all enemies. Of course, making new enemies on the way and becoming enemies to ourselves, self-destructing. I am not against maximalism. If it is maximalism of right kind, nonviolent maximalism, we need nonviolent maximalism the most. There is no alternative than turning enemies into friends, building institutions of nonviolent governance, which is the only true democracy. When people talk to each other, not kill each other. We must learn and teach how to stop violence without violence. And we already have a huge body of knowledge and nonviolent techniques. It is just a matter of choice to commit ourselves to peace as big human family on common planet. Let's build together the world where everybody refuses to kill and there are no wars.
Thank you so much, Yurii. Thank you for coming to the Veterans for Peace Convention. It's our honor to have you here this evening. And thank you so much for being able to come despite all of the troubles and the trials that you went through. You provide us even more with what we speak about all the time, that Veterans for Peace are for peace and that we are against buying more armaments to continue the destruction that goes on in Ukraine. I hope, and I know we all hope, to be able to continue working together with you for peace. Thank you. Marjorie Cohn is Professor Emeritus, Thomas Jefferson School of Law. She taught from 1991 to 2016 She's a former criminal defense attorney and past president of the National Lawyers Guild. Marjorie lectures, writes, provides commentary for local, regional, national, international media. She's co-host of Law and Disorder on WBAI in New York and heard on 150 stations nationwide. Marjorie is founding dean of the Monique and Roland Weil People's Academy of International Law. And Marjorie is a lifetime associate member of Veterans for Peace and member of the Veterans for Peace Advisory Board. She co-authored a book with Kathy Gilbard called The Rules of Engagement: The Politics and Honor of Military Dissent. Marjorie has been a wonderful supporter of Veterans for Peace and close friend and colleague of Daniel Ellsberg. Margie.
Thank you so much, Susan. And it is really my honor to be speaking, honoring Dan tonight. We dedicate this convention to Daniel Ellsberg, a beloved member of our Veterans for Peace Advisory Board. Dan died on June 16th at the age of 92. Dan displayed uncommon courage in 1971 when he publicized the 7,000-page top secret Pentagon papers, which he had helped to write. As a consultant to the Department of Defense, Dan also drafted Defense Secretary Robert McNamara's plans for nuclear war, which Dan later spent his life trying to prevent. Dan joined the Marines in 1954 and served in the Middle East, but saw no action. He was very pro-military. But in 1968, while working for RAND, Dan's views began to change. In 1969, Dan attended a War Resisters League meeting in Pennsylvania. It was there he heard Randy Kaler voice his intention to refuse the draft. Dan was deeply moved. He later said, "I left the auditorium and found a deserted men's room. I sat on the floor and cried for over an hour, just sobbing. The only time in my life I've reacted to something like that." Dan began to oppose the war, joining anti-war demonstrations, writing articles and letters to the editor, and testifying at trials of draft resistors. He resigned from RAND. In his book, Secrets, a memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers, Dan wrote that the Pentagon Papers exposed the secrets 5 presidents had withheld and the lies they told about US decision-making in Vietnam. This truth-telling set in motion a train of events, including criminal White House efforts to silence or incapacitate me, Dan said. Much more important, these particular Oval Office crimes helped to topple the president, an act that was crucial to ending the war. Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, called Dan Ellsberg the most dangerous man in America who had to be stopped at all costs. But Dan was not stopped. Facing 115 years in prison for violation of the Espionage Act and conspiracy charges, Dan fought back. The case against him was dismissed due to egregious government misconduct. Dan's story was portrayed in the Oscar-nominated film, The Most Dangerous Man in America. Edward Snowden told Dan that film strengthened his intention to release the NSA documents. In 2014, Dan gave a keynote speech at the 45th reunion of the Stanford Anti-Vietnam War movement. He explained how the United States came dangerously close to using nuclear weapons during the Vietnam War. In 1965, the Joint Chiefs recommended to President Lyndon Johnson that US forces hit targets up to the Chinese border. Dan thought their real aim was to provoke China into responding, and then the US would cross into China and demolish the communists with nuclear weapons. Dan wrote in an email, "When I copied the Pentagon Papers in 1969, I had every reason to think I would be spending the rest of my life behind bars. It was a fate I would gladly have accepted if it meant hastening the end of the Vietnam War, unlikely as that seemed and was." Dan's courageous actions did help end that war. In an email responding to Dan's revelation of his terminal pancreatic cancer diagnosis, Bui Van Nguyen, Secretary General of the Vietnam USA Society, wrote, "We highly appreciate Dan's goodwill, friendship, and love to Vietnam, and his support of the struggle for national independence and reunification of the country by the Vietnamese people. And with his courage to reveal the truth and machination about the American-Vietnam War by the US government, and waging the waves of peace, anti-war movement, and campaigns to call for early ending of the war that saved hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides." The Pentagon Papers remain today the most vital discussion of a war from the inside, Seymour Hersh wrote in a tribute to Dan. Cy Hersh broke the story of the My Lai massacre, which the US government covered up for a year. It was a war crime committed by US forces who murdered hundreds of elderly men, women, and children during the Vietnam War. Dan helped launch the anti-nuclear movement. For more than 5 decades, he spent nearly every waking hour working for peace and trying to prevent nuclear war. After his diagnosis, Dan continued the struggle to avoid a nuclear holocaust. "I will continue as long as I'm able to help these efforts," he wrote in an email to family and friends 3.5 months before he died. "I feel lucky and grateful about having a few months more to enjoy life with my wife and family, and in which to continue to pursue the urgent goal of working with others to avert nuclear war in Ukraine or Taiwan or anywhere else." Until he died, Dan spoke out wherever he could, in the media and on webinars, imploring us to prevent nuclear war. Those who make the nuclear weapons and the investment banks that finance them have never been interested in limiting them. Their only interest is to have better ones, Dan told me when I interviewed him in mid-March for Truth Out. Those same people have never been interested in keeping Russia from having H-bombs, ICBMs, or MWHs, multiple warheads, at the cost of giving up ours. Dan wrote in his book, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, "Contrary to popular understanding, the strategy has not been a matter of deterrence of nuclear attack on the United States, but rather the illusionary one of improving first strike capability. To reduce the risks of nuclear war," Dan told me, "it is essential that members of NATO press the US and others to renounce the atrocious NATO backing of the first use of nuclear weapons." The current risk of nuclear war over Ukraine is as great as the world has ever seen, Dan wrote. He warned that nuclear war between the US and Russia would result in nuclear winter. That means that more than 100 million tons of smoke and soot from firestorms in cities set ablaze by either side, striking either first or second, would be lofted into the stratosphere where it would not rain out and would envelop the globe within days. That pall would block up to 70% of sunlight for years, destroying all harvests worldwide and causing death by starvation for most of the humans and other vertebrates on Earth, he wrote. Dan told me, this is not a species to be trusted with nuclear weapons. It's urgent to get this war ended. We need a ceasefire and negotiations before Putin is confronted with any prospect of losing Crimea and all of Donbass, which would make the danger of nuclear war initiated by Russia more dangerous than any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Dan was alarmed at how the Ukraine war could escalate, especially given Zelensky's effort, backed by the US, to expel Russia from all areas, including those it had held for 8 years. Dan was doubtful that negotiations would ever begin if Zelensky continued to insist that every Russian troop leave Ukraine before negotiations can occur. If the US were to enter the war directly with its pilots and combat troops and missions, I believe that Putin would very likely carry out his threat to initiate tactical nuclear war, even with a high probability of escalating, which would threaten all of humanity with nuclear winter, Dan told me. The whistleblowers and truth tellers who have followed in Dan's footsteps include Chelsea Manning, Catherine Gunn, John Kiriakou, Edward Snowden, Daniel Hale, Reality Winner, and Julian Assange. Dan was one of the co-chairs with Noam Chomsky and Alice Walker of Assange Defense. Every empire requires secrecy to cloak its acts of violence that maintain it as an empire, Dan testified at the January 20th Belmarsh Tribunal opposing Assange's extradition from the UK to the US, where he faces 175 years in prison for exposing US war crimes. If you're going to use the Espionage Act against a journalist in blatant violation of the First Amendment, Dan stated, the First Amendment is essentially gone. In 2008, during the Bush administration, when I was president of the National Lawyers Guild, Dan delivered the keynote address to our convention in Detroit. He warned of the dangers of unchecked executive power, saying the US president is not a king. Dan was arrested 90 times, 90. He referred to his fellow arrestees as my tribe. During a webinar honoring Dan on Nagasaki Day, Tarak Koff said, "We respected him for all that he did, but loved him for who he was. He showed the world how to live with courage and joy, even in the darkest times. He always smiled when getting arrested, which was often. Witnessing him smiling and flashing the peace sign behind his back when in handcuffs was priceless. Dan demonstrated a profound humanity and a life of principled resistance." Tarak said that Dan was a rare human being, truly a spiritual giant who loved and cared for others more than himself. Yet he was always approachable, always one of us. He was a friend and a brother to everyone in Veterans for Peace. And he always signed his emails, "Love, Dan," as if he were family. He showed by example how to live, and as we all know, faced death with the same dignity, joy, and love that he lived with. Dan's wife, Patricia, said that in the 4 months between his diagnosis and his death, she never saw him happier. He had lived such a noble life. His death was as blessed as his life. Dan told her, "I feel so relieved. I don't feel the weight on my shoulders anymore." Dan enjoyed eating lox and bagels and salty food he was forbidden by his cardiologist for eating for so many years. But in the last 4 months, he ate his fill and enjoyed every bit of it. Dan was a brilliant, intense, compassionate man with a great sense of humor and a remarkably curious mind. I cannot count the times he called me for legal analysis of the US government's illegal action du jour. I am proud to have called him my friend. The theme of this convention is choose peace, stand up, speak out. Dan chose peace. He stood up and he spoke out. We must honor Dan's extraordinary legacy by committing ourselves to peace and the struggle to protect the world from nuclear annihilation. Dan Ellsberg, presente.
Thank you, Marjorie. Our next speaker, it is also an honor and a pleasure and wonderful to have you with us, Mike Ferner, as interim director of Veterans for Peace. Mike, it's your turn.
Thank you, Susan. And I'm not just honored, but ecstatic to be here. Already the people who have spoken would make this a wonderful convention, and we're just in the opening. I wanted to make sure everybody knew that Yurii went through 6 air raids today, and it's after 3 o'clock his time in the morning. And he's been very patient with all of the manipulations it's taken to get schedules together to have him speak. And I wanted to thank him for learning English so he could speak to us in English. What he said about war being madness, war is madness. A simple, powerful quote. And as a conscientious objector getting out of the Navy, I really appreciate what he's doing to help Ukrainian conscientious objectors. Susan and I have been working with David Courtwright to try to be able to give a voice, a platform to Yurii, to the Ukrainian objectors, resistors that he's working with, and also to Russian resistors. And we're hoping to be able to let you know more about that before the conference is over. Marjorie, thank you so much for that wonderful tribute to Dan Ellsberg. Is beautiful. And I want people to know that Dan Ellsberg's publicist said that she would consider it an honor to help Veterans for Peace get our message out more widely as a way of continuing Dan's work. And we're looking forward, I am personally looking forward to working with her. So hello and welcome every one of you here today, and happy 101st birthday yesterday to Howard's Inn. What a truly remarkable and noteworthy gathering this is. The voice of Veterans for Peace is as indispensable as ever. I'm privileged to live on the western edge of Lake Erie in Toledo, Ohio. As often as I can, I sit outside and admire the eagles and ospreys, the rising sun and the thunderclouds, the butterflies and purple martins that fly over and through our small yard of wildflowers. That's where I leave the day behind and just daydream. Sometimes about the billions of years of evolution that left us with the sun at just the right distance that powers everything, an atmosphere we can breathe, and a planet with everything we need. And I wonder, did all these countless life forms survive and evolve for all those millennia so that one tiny fraction of just one species in one brief moment of time could extinguish our entire home. Every planet and animal living here with us because of their greed and madness. Once again, as always, it seems, the madmen's empire, the empire we are citizens of, rages across the globe. Few have the audacity or the bravery to stand up and say, the emperor has no clothes. But Veterans for Peace does, loudly and often. We are the keepers, the guardians of an organization that has a storied 38-year history and a collective wisdom that is relevant as ever. I accepted this job at a very difficult time for Veterans for Peace. In the 5 months since then, I can report that the board, the staff, and no small number of skilled, dedicated volunteers have created a real sea change at VFP's national level by donating literally thousands of hours of the most precious thing any of us has, time. I've been active with VFP since its founding, and this is without a doubt the most skilled and knowledgeable board I've seen, pulling together in the same direction and functioning as one. Our staff is too small in numbers, but works above and beyond on a daily basis. For myself, I'll just say that the bride, Sue Carter, whom some of you know, and turns 76 tomorrow, has accepted the role of VFP widow with grace and nearly unlimited patience, as do so many of our partners. And my personal thanks goes out to every one of those partners. I hesitated before taking this job, knowing its difficulties, but two things coincided to move me to say yes. First, Dan Ellsberg's beautiful letter announcing his terminal illness, in which he said little about his fate and much about the rewards of activism and the work yet to be done. And a second thing, a Phil Oakes song, When I'm Gone, with these poignant lines. Can't add my name to the fight when I'm gone, and I won't be laughing at the lies when I'm gone. Can't be singing louder than the guns when I'm gone, so I guess I'll have to do it while I'm here. That video of Phil is linked at the bottom of each of my emails. Give it a listen next time. After feeling overwhelmed for a while, I can now say I'm glad to be here, contributing something real to an organization I love and to a movement that believes every citizen of the empire has both the responsibility and the opportunity, if they wish, to get the empire off the backs of people at home and abroad and bring its ruinous reign to an end. During this convention, you'll hear from some of VFP's most active projects, like the Climate Crisis and Militarism Project we heard from earlier, the Korea Peace Campaign, Deported Veterans, and the Nuclear Abolition Working Group. But I want to take just a minute to mention the work of two others. First, Save Our VA, or SOVA. Every week, Shelley Rocket, with 2 T's, sends out a call to action to over 1,000 people on the SOVA list, inviting them, with a click of their mouse, to tell public officials to keep the VA funded and to protect it from the privateers. Second, the Golden Rule Peace Boat is in the final weeks of its 11,000-mile Great Loop journey, stopping at 100 ports, where roughly 1,000 supporters organized some 400 events, generating 80 news reports and over 40 mayoral proclamations, and several new members, including 2 who are now active in VFP fundraising. And keep in mind that the Golden Rule costs VFP almost nothing. 90% of its operating expenses come from donations specifically for and because of its mission, leaving very little for the VFP General Fund to pay. It would be hard for VFP to get more bang for the buck than it does from the Golden Rule. In tomorrow's business meeting, you'll hear more stats on our ongoing work. Susan and I will give you some specifics about the worrisome and rough seas VFP has weathered in the past year. But for now, I just want to thank each of you for being here to learn and to celebrate with your comrades in this sometimes wacky but beautiful organization called Veterans for Peace. With love, thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I guess it's time now for me to do my welcome to all of you to the Veterans for Peace annual convention. We in VFP have worked hard these past few months to design a program that is reflective of the world and times we encounter on a daily basis. This past year has been filled with surging potential disasters, political, economic, humanitarian, at home and abroad. On a daily basis, we witness our government encourage corporate interests to enlarge their coffers with the death and destruction of people and all living things, thousands of miles from our borders and toward people of color here. With an ever-increasing military budget and presence on over 800 bases throughout the world, while neglecting the needs of the world's people and living environment, water, food, health, and medical care. Instead, we produce instruments that kill, maim, harm. We live in the most unsettling, disturbing, destructive times. And yet, despite all obstacles, our organization, Veterans for Peace, continues to move along dynamically because of the dedication and determination of you, our members. You show the proud veteran voice for peace in our country, in our world, through national projects that depict the deleterious impact on climate from United States militarism and the war industrial complex. You show your courage and determination for the values of VFP through work for peace in Ukraine. The Golden Rule travels through the Great Loop and trip to Cuba, bringing messages of solidarity with the Cuban people. You show it through your hard work to save the VA for veterans care and prevent privatization through corporate interest. You show it through your activism in the streets for peace. Thank you all. Veterans for Peace strives through the collective efforts of members, chapters, national projects, working groups to build a culture of peace from our experiences of war and destruction. We inform the public of the causes and costs of war. Our work includes advocating for a dismantling of the war economy and continuous work to end all wars. We affirm our responsibility to work for peace and abolish war as an instrument of national policy. Our members actively work to prevent the spread of militarism in our society, change U.S. foreign policy from endless war to diplomacy, and to help our national leaders have a long-term vision of peace and justice. Our members believe one of the most important components to ending war is to work for peace. VFP has joined with other organizations to support war resistors and request that humanitarian organizations and governments provide a safe haven for their sanctuary and support. We are an organization of former soldiers and veterans of U.S. wars in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and various other United States military interventions. We oppose militarism and war. We support the right of conscientious objectors, potential conscripts, and soldiers to refuse to participate in war. We urge governments to grant visas and humanitarian entry to war resistors and call upon civil society networks to offer them sanctuary and social support. Please listen to Elie Wiesel. The greatest evil in the world is not anger or hatred, but indifference. I think of those lives changed forever by war and conflict, and along with millions of others, rededicate myself to healing the wounds of war, to working for peace and social justice, to bringing an end to armed conflict, to move us from a war economy to a peace economy, to care for those harmed, and to stop this insanity called war, to end power and destruction, to instead be life-giving instead of death-giving. For if we who have known war don't dedicate ourselves to ending it, who will? It is our hope that this program will inspire you to keep on your wonderful work for peace. Thank you all. At this moment, we will go to Jenny Pacanowski, who is not able to join us live, but we do have a wonderful videotape of Jenny's poem.
Sorry, hang on one sec.
The day you waved at me for the first time, the convoy transformed into a parade. I lowered my weapon, waved back like a beauty queen in desert camo. A parade of freedom, of winning hearts and minds, of this liberated country. My mission was clear. We had arrived to help, to save, to heal, to love. We convoyed into your village with our green ambulances. The leaders presented you and the other children for us to poke and prod with our instruments of medicine. I taught you about cough drops, how not to swallow it whole, to take in the medicine first. You nodded, and I smiled. I listened to your hearts, the bounding and the slushing as blood pulsed through your veins. My heart burst with purpose. We lived another day together, immersed in a war. I left, you stayed. I was assigned to the road to the convoys. You went to begging, to rock throwing. We laughed when we saw you flicking us the bird. Until the explosions silenced us. Your screams were deafening, or was it mine? I scrambled around the crater. The dust was blinding until I saw the blood. Desert sucks up blood quicker than water. I saw you running away with that cell phone, that detonator in your little brown hand. Die, you little motherfucker. You are no longer a child with a beating heart, sucking on cough drops. You are a threat, running across your desert of sand that rakes my skin, much like your existence rapes my idealism. Die, you little motherfucker. You have come into a world that hates you, wants to kill you, you little terrorist. We can't tell the difference between insurgents and civilians. You all look the same to us, different than us. You are the enemy. Die, you little motherfucker. I see 2004 like a movie, reeling backward in my mind, drawing forth the moving targets. I mean the civilians, I mean the children, I mean the detonators. You are the blurry in my pictures. You are as indistinct as the shambles of concrete you call home. How do I return home? What if I said I didn't know? I didn't know how to stop the machine, not the convoy, not the war, not even myself. I reached out, but my weapon separated us. I wanted to pull you in close, but all you could feel was cold, hard steel. What if I said I was sorry? We ever occupied you. I wanted to hold you, redefining love unconditionally, giving you my blood after we had gutted you, your country. Please help me put my gun away, my armor, my hate, and redefine my love unconditionally for humanity, including you. Please, let me come home. Please, let us all come home from the war inside us all.
Well, hello. Susan had to leave a little unexpectedly, so I'm here to invite you to please join us in the poetry section that is coming up. And you need to go to the poetry link that, I hope someone will put in the chat. The link was also in the registration information, but if someone could please put the poetry
It
link.
is in the chat.
It is. Okay, thank you, Becky Looney. Okay, the poetry link is in the chat, and you need to use that link to get to the poetry section. You won't be able to see it just staying on here. So there's also the social room that will be going on until, I guess, midnight Eastern or Central Time after the poetry. Thank you all so much.
The social room will go on as long as anybody is in it.
Oh, okay. Well, Ellen, why didn't you just do this? Okay, thank you all, everyone, for being here, for everybody who's spoken so far tonight, and let's go enjoy the poetry. Thank you.